In the annals of World War II, among the stories of great battles and heroic stands, there exists a tale so peculiar, so inventive, that it reads more like fiction than historical fact. This is the story of the Ghost Army, a phantom force that never fired a shot in anger, yet saved thousands of lives. A unit of artists and engineers who wielded paintbrushes and sound effects instead of rifles, creating illusions so convincing that they fooled the German military repeatedly across the battlefields of Europe. This is their story, complete, detailed, and true. Part 1. The Birth of Illusion. The year was 1943. The tide of war had begun to turn, but victory remained distant and uncertain. The Allied forces, planning their eventual invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe, faced a fundamental problem that had plagued military commanders since ancient times: how to be in two places at once. How to make an enemy divide their forces, to guess wrong about where the hammer would fall. The answer would come not from generals or admirals, but from an unlikely collection of artists, designers, sound engineers, and creative minds who would form one of the most unusual military units ever assembled. They would be officially designated as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, but history would remember them by a different name: the Ghost Army. The concept of military deception was nothing new. Throughout history, commanders had employed ruses and stratagems to confuse their enemies. The Trojan horse, Hannibal's cattle with burning branches. But what the American military was about to attempt was deception on an industrial scale, using the cutting-edge technology and techniques of the 20th century. The man who would bring this vision to life was Colonel Harry Reeder, working closely with Lieutenant Colonel Clifford Simonson. They understood that modern warfare had become a contest of information as much as firepower. If you could make the enemy think your forces were somewhere they weren't, you could manipulate their deployments, waste their resources, and most importantly, save American lives. But creating a phantom army required more than military discipline. It required imagination. It required artists who could paint realistic shadows on rubber tanks. It required sound engineers who could record and broadcast the noise of tank columns and troop movements. It required radio operators who could create entire fictional units through carefully crafted transmissions. Most of all, it required people who could think like Hollywood set designers, creating a stage where the audience was trying to kill you. The recruitment process was unlike anything the military had seen before. Rather than seeking out the strongest or most aggressive soldiers, recruiters visited art schools and design firms. They sought graduates of institutions like the Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the Philadelphia Museum School of Industrial Art. They recruited commercial artists, fashion designers, sound technicians from radio stations, and even a few actors. Among the early recruits was Bill Blass, who would later become one of America's most famous fashion designers. There was Ellsworth Kelly, destined to become a renowned abstract artist. Art Kane, future fashion photographer. These men would trade their easels and cameras for a peculiar kind of warfare. The unit officially activated on January 20th, 1944, at Camp Forrest in Tennessee. The men who assembled there must have wondered what they had gotten themselves into. Instead of weapons training, they received instruction in camouflage techniques, theatrical scenery construction, and sonic deception. Their arsenal would consist of inflatable tanks and trucks, sound effect recordings, and portable radio transmitters. The Ghost Army was divided into 4 main operational components, each with its own specialized role in the grand illusion. The 603rd Camouflage Engineer Battalion would handle the visual deception, the fake tanks, artillery, and vehicles that would be seen by enemy observation posts and aerial reconnaissance. The 36th Combat Engineer Regiment would provide additional engineering support and security. The Signal Company Special would create phantom radio traffic, simulating the communications of entire divisions, and the 34th Signal Service Company Special would handle sonic deception, broadcasting recorded sounds of armies on the move. Training was intensive and often surreal. Men learned to inflate massive rubber tanks that weighed only about 120 pounds but looked, from a distance, exactly like real Sherman tanks weighing 30 tons. They practiced assembling and positioning these decoys in darkness, knowing that most of their work would be done at night to avoid scrutiny. They studied the organizational structure of real combat units so they could convincingly imitate their radio communications. The sonic deception equipment was particularly ingenious. Engineers had traveled to actual army bases to record the sounds of real military operations. Tanks starting their engines and moving in formation, trucks being loaded and unloaded, artillery pieces being deployed, engineers shouting orders. All of these sounds were captured on massive wire recordings that could be played back through powerful speakers mounted on half-tracks. The recordings were layered and mixed to create convincing soundscapes of military activity. A recording might begin with the distant sound of vehicles approaching, growing gradually louder. Then the sounds of engines idling, men's voices, equipment being moved. The audio engineers could simulate an entire armored division preparing for battle, when in reality, there might be only a handful of men and their sound trucks. The inflatable decoys were marvels of engineering and artistry. Made of rubberized canvas stretched over inflatable frames, they could be deployed in minutes by small teams. But the real magic came in the details. Artists would paint realistic shadows, weathering and markings on each vehicle. They would add fake track marks in the mud around inflatable tanks. They would string realistic-looking camouflage netting over the decoys. From the air or through binoculars from a distance, these rubber props were nearly indistinguishable from real military hardware. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element. The signal company operators studied the communication patterns of real military units. They learned the proper protocols, the types of messages that would be sent, the frequencies and call signs used. They could create the radio signature of an entire division, hundreds of fake messages per day, all coordinated to tell a consistent story of troop movements, supply requests, and operational planning. By spring of 1944, the Ghost Army was as ready as they could be. They knew their equipment, they understood their mission, but they hadn't yet faced the ultimate test, fooling a real enemy who was actively trying to kill them. That test would come soon enough. On May 2nd, 1944, advance elements of the Ghost Army boarded ships bound for England. The bulk of the unit would follow over the coming weeks. They arrived in a Britain transformed into a massive military staging ground, preparing for the invasion that everyone knew was coming, but no one could speak about openly. The Ghost Army established their base and continued training, now with the benefit of British expertise in deception operations. The British had been conducting their own strategic deception campaigns throughout the war, including Operation Fortitude, the elaborate scheme to convince the Germans that the D-Day invasion would land at Calais rather than Normandy. The American Ghost Army troops watched and learned as the British 27th Armored Brigade, part of the larger deception effort, created dummy landing craft and fake military installations across southern England. The scale was staggering. Entire phantom army groups that existed only to be observed by German reconnaissance aircraft. But the Ghost Army's role would be different. While strategic deception operations, like Fortitude, worked on the grand scale to shape overall German strategy, the Ghost Army would operate at the tactical level, directly supporting combat operations in the field. They would travel with the advancing army, creating localized illusions that would mislead German commanders about Allied strength and intentions in specific sectors. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. The Ghost Army men, still in England, could only listen to the reports and wait their turn. Their opportunity to prove themselves would come soon enough. The first elements of the Ghost Army crossed the English Channel on July 15, 1944, landing on Utah Beach in Normandy. What greeted them was not the clean, orderly military operation they might have imagined, but the chaotic reality of a battlefield. The beaches were cluttered with wrecked equipment. The inland areas were scenes of ongoing combat, with the bocage hedgerows of Normandy providing natural defenses that made every field a potential fortress. Their first mission came almost immediately. Operation Elephant was designed to simulate 2 full divisions near the front lines, while the real units moved to different positions for an offensive. It would be the Ghost Army's baptism by fire, and it would teach them lessons they would carry through the rest of the war. The men moved into position near the town of Saint-Lô, which had been devastated by weeks of fighting. They inflated their rubber tanks and positioned them to be visible from German observation posts. They strung camouflage netting and painted shadows. The sonic trucks moved into position, ready to broadcast their recordings of armored columns. But this wasn't training anymore. German artillery could strike at any moment. Enemy reconnaissance aircraft flew overhead. If the deception was discovered, if the Germans realized these weren't real tanks, the Ghost Army men would be sitting ducks. A small force of artists and engineers facing veteran German troops. The tension was unbearable. Men who had spent their civilian lives sketching fashion designs or recording radio programs now crouched in foxholes, listening to the whistle of incoming artillery shells. The rubber tanks they'd positioned so carefully took hits, some shredded by shrapnel, others damaged beyond repair. The men learned to work faster, to stay low, to move between positions using any available cover. And yet the deception held. German forces reacted to the Phantom divisions as if they were real. Their artillery targeted the decoy positions. Their intelligence reports noted the presence of American armor in the sector. The real Allied divisions were able to reposition without German interference, and the subsequent offensive achieved tactical surprise. Operation Elephant taught the Ghost Army invaluable lessons. They learned to operate under fire. They learned the importance of coordination with real combat units. Friendly artillery and air support needed to know where the Ghost Army was operating to avoid firing on them. They learned that no deception was perfect, that some losses were inevitable, but that even an imperfect illusion could achieve results. They also learned something more profound. Their work was saving lives. Every German artillery shell that struck a rubber tank was a shell that didn't hit real soldiers. Every German division held in place, watching Phantom American forces, was a division not attacking real American positions. The artists and engineers of the Ghost Army had found their purpose on the battlefield. As summer turned to fall in 1944, the situation in France transformed dramatically. The Allied breakout from Normandy became a race across France. German forces retreated and the Allies pursued. The Ghost Army found themselves in almost constant motion, conducting operation after operation as the front lines shifted rapidly. Operation Brittany came in early August. While General George Patton's Third Army raced eastward across France, a smaller force was detached to secure the Brittany Peninsula and its vital ports. The Ghost Army was tasked with making this smaller force appear much larger than it actually was, to prevent German forces from realizing how thinly stretched the Americans were in that sector. The men of the Ghost Army found themselves in the ancient city of Brest, setting up their equipment while real combat units pushed toward the German-held ports. They created the illusion of multiple armored and infantry divisions converging on the area. Inflatable tanks appeared in fields. Radio operators simulated command posts and supply operations. Sonic trucks broadcast the sounds of massive troop concentrations. The deception worked. German commanders in Brittany prepared to face a much larger force than actually existed, allocating troops and resources to defend against an assault that would come from different directions than they expected. When the real Allied forces struck, they achieved surprise and momentum. It was during operations like these that the Ghost Army developed their tradecraft to a fine art. They learned to think like intelligence analysts, considering what the Germans would be looking for and how to provide convincing evidence of what wasn't there. They understood that deception wasn't just about creating fake equipment. It was about creating a narrative, a story that enemy intelligence would believe because it fit their expectations and confirmed what they wanted to know. The visual deception teams became experts at mimicry. They would study actual units, learning how they positioned their vehicles, how they camouflaged their positions, what kind of traffic patterns they created. Then they would replicate these details with their inflatables and props. A real tank battalion would have supply trucks moving between positions, so the Ghost Army would ensure a few real trucks were seen moving near their rubber tanks. A real headquarters would have radio antennas and guards, so the Ghost Army would set up proper-looking antenna arrays and post sentries. The sonic deception crews developed an almost musical sense of timing and orchestration. They learned that sounds needed to tell a story over time. The recording of an armored column couldn't just loop endlessly, that would be suspicious. Instead, they created programs of sound that evolved naturally. The column would arrive, sounds indicating vehicles being serviced and maintained, radio chatter, eventually the sounds of the column preparing to move again. Each element needed to fit together to create a convincing audio landscape. Operation Brest followed in September as Allied forces worked to capture the major port city. The Ghost Army supported the operation by simulating American strength in multiple locations, forcing the Germans to spread their defensive efforts. The artists would set up their equipment, create the illusion of a major force, then pack up and move to a new location to create another illusion. Sometimes they were executing multiple deceptions simultaneously in different sectors. The pace was exhausting. The men worked through days and nights assembling equipment, moving positions, always aware that German reconnaissance could spot them at any moment. They became adept at the rapid deployment of their decoys, learning to inflate and position a full tank company in under an hour of darkness. But they also found moments of grace and even humor amid the chaos of war. The artists in the unit couldn't suppress their creative impulses. They sketched the French countryside. They painted watercolors of ruined villages. Some created satirical cartoons of military life. Others designed elaborate patches and insignia for the unit, though these were never officially authorized. The Ghost Army's existence was classified, and they wore no distinctive markings. In the town of Trevière, some of the men encountered French civilians who had been living under German occupation for 4 years. The Ghost Army troops, with their artistic backgrounds, were often more cosmopolitan and culturally aware than typical American soldiers. Many spoke some French. They appreciated European art and architecture. Bonds formed between the liberators and the liberated small human connections in the midst of industrial-scale warfare. By September of 1944, the Allied advance had carried the Ghost Army to Luxembourg, the tiny nation nestled between France, Belgium, and Germany. Here, in one of the smallest countries in Europe, the Ghost Army would conduct what many consider their most successful operation. The situation was delicate. Luxembourg City, the capital, had been liberated, but German forces remained nearby. The broader strategic picture was concerning. Allied supply lines were stretched thin after the rapid advance across France. The failed Operation Market Garden in the Netherlands had cost the Allies dearly and ended hopes of a quick end to the war in 1944. The Ghost Army was tasked with a complex mission: simulate the presence of the entire 6th Armored Division in Luxembourg, while that division actually moved to a different sector to prepare for offensive operations. This wasn't a brief overnight deception. This operation, codenamed Wiltz, would need to be maintained for several days. The men moved into positions around the Luxembourg countryside in mid-September. They had perfected their craft by this point, but this operation would test them in new ways. They needed to simulate not just static positions, but the full range of activities of an armored division at rest: maintenance operations, supply activities, reconnaissance patrols, and command functions. The inflatable tanks went up in carefully chosen locations, visible from key vantage points, but positioned realistically for a unit that was temporarily out of the line. Artists added authentic details: spare track sections lying near the decoys, fuel cans positioned nearby, even laundry lines strung between rubber vehicles to suggest soldiers were living in these positions. The sonic crews created elaborate soundscapes. They broadcast recordings of maintenance work, the clang of tools on metal, the rumble of engines being tested. They simulated the arrival of supply convoys. They even created the sounds of tank crews conducting training exercises, putting their vehicles through maneuvers. But the radio deception was the real centerpiece of Operation Wiltz. The signal company operators created the full communication signature of an armored division headquarters. They sent messages about fuel supplies, maintenance schedules, personnel matters, and reconnaissance reports. They coordinated with actual Allied units to ensure that official communications referenced the 6th Armored Division's presence in Luxembourg. They even arranged for liaison officers from other units to visit the Ghost Army's fake headquarters, where they would be briefed and sent away convinced they had met with the real division staff. The physical headquarters was a masterpiece of set design. The Ghost Army established it in a prominent building in Luxembourg City, complete with proper signage, guards in appropriate uniforms, a steady flow of military traffic, and all the administrative bustle of a real division command post. Officers of the Ghost Army played the roles of division staff, complete with knowledge of the 6th Armored's actual operations history, so they could answer questions convincingly. To make the deception complete, Ghost Army personnel even frequented the cafes and bars of Luxembourg City, carefully dropping hints about the division's presence. They wore the 6th Armored Division's distinctive Super 6th shoulder patch. They complained about the same things real soldiers would complain about: bad coffee, uncomfortable quarters, missing mail from home. They struck up conversations with locals, always in character. The operation was a stunning success. German intelligence reports from this period noted the 6th Armored Division's presence in Luxembourg. German forces adjusted their dispositions accordingly. Meanwhile, the real 6th Armored Division was able to move undetected to its new positions, achieving operational surprise when it eventually entered combat. But Operation Wiltz revealed something else. The Ghost Army had become more than just a deception unit. They had become skilled intelligence operators and psychological warfare specialists. They understood how information flowed, how enemy intelligence worked, and how to manipulate perception at every level. The men also grew close to the people of Luxembourg. The tiny country had suffered greatly under Nazi occupation, and its people were grateful to their American liberators. Ghost Army soldiers were invited into homes, shared meals with families, and formed friendships that would last decades after the war. Some would return to Luxembourg years later and find that they were still remembered. It was in Luxembourg that the Ghost Army truly came into its own as a unit. They had proven themselves under fire in Normandy. They had refined their techniques across France, but in Luxembourg, they executed a complex, multi-layered deception that required not just technical skill, but genuine artistry in the manipulation of appearance and perception. December 1944 brought the European theater its greatest crisis since D-Day. On December 16th, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route they had used to invade France in 1940. The offensive caught Allied forces off guard, creating a dangerous bulge in the American lines and threatening to split the Allied armies. The Battle of the Bulge, as it would be known, was Germany's last major offensive of the war in the West. It was also one of the bloodiest battles American forces would fight in Europe, and the Ghost Army found themselves in the middle of it. As German panzers punched through American lines and winter storms grounded Allied aircraft, confusion reigned. The Ghost Army's initial assignment was to help simulate American strength in sectors that had been stripped of troops to reinforce the breakthrough points. But as the situation evolved hour by hour, their missions changed rapidly. Operation Koblenz was hastily organized in late December. The Ghost Army was ordered to create the illusion of American forces preparing to cross the Rhine River near Koblenz, Germany. The goal was to tie down German reserves that might otherwise be committed to the Ardennes offensive. The men worked in brutal winter conditions. The coldest winter in Europe in decades had arrived, with temperatures dropping well below freezing. Snow and ice made every task more difficult. The inflatable vehicles, designed for warmer weather, became brittle in the extreme cold. Rubber that was supposed to be flexible cracked and tore. Inflation became a constant battle against the weather. The sonic equipment had its own problems. The cold affected the wire recordings, making them brittle. Speakers that had worked perfectly in autumn now struggled against frozen condensation. The men had to improvise constantly, wrapping equipment in tarps and blankets, running engines to generate heat, finding creative solutions to technical problems that had never come up during training. And through it all, They maintained the deception. Ghost Army units set up positions near the Rhine, broadcasting sounds of bridge-building equipment and engineering operations. Radio operators simulated the communications of assault forces preparing to cross the river. The illusion was convincing enough that German forces allocated troops to defend against the phantom crossing, troops that were desperately needed elsewhere. Operation Bougainville followed in January 1945 as Allied forces worked to reduce the bulge and push German troops back. The Ghost Army simulated the 70th Infantry Division, allowing the real division to reposition for offensive operations. They operated in conditions that were almost unbearable, foxholes filled with snow, fingers too numb to work equipment properly, the constant threat of frostbite and hypothermia. The men learned to sleep in shifts, with some staying awake to prevent their companions from freezing in their sleep. They shared body heat in cramped dugouts. They learned which streams hadn't frozen solid and could provide water. They burned anything they could find for warmth, though fires had to be carefully controlled to avoid giving away their positions. Several Ghost Army soldiers suffered from severe frostbite during these operations. Some would carry the effects for the rest of their lives, missing toes, damaged fingers, scarred skin that would ache in cold weather decades later. But they continued their missions, knowing that real combat units were suffering even worse. It was during this winter period that the Ghost Army truly earned the respect of the regular combat troops they supported. Infantry soldiers and tankers, who initially scoffed at the idea of artists and sound technicians playing at war, came to appreciate what the Ghost Army accomplished. Word spread through the army about the strange unit that could make enemy intelligence officers see entire divisions where only a few hundred men and their rubber tanks existed. The Battle of the Bulge also brought the Ghost Army closer to actual combat than they had been before. German infiltrators were operating behind American lines, sometimes dressed in American uniforms. Artillery fire was more intense. In several cases, Ghost Army positions came under direct German observation, requiring the men to maintain their deceptions while essentially trapped under enemy watch. During Operation Bougainville, a German reconnaissance patrol stumbled onto a Ghost Army position one night. The resulting firefight was brief but intense, the first time the unit had engaged in direct combat. 2 Ghost Army soldiers were wounded. The German patrol was driven off, but the incident brought home the reality that these men were not just artists playing a role. They were soldiers in a war zone, at risk every moment. By March 1945, the tide had turned decisively. The Battle of the Bulge had ended in Allied victory, though at terrible cost. German forces were retreating on all fronts. The Allied armies approached the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier before the German heartland. Crossing the Rhine was both a practical military necessity and a symbolic moment. No enemy army had successfully crossed the Rhine into Germany in force since Napoleon. The Allies planned to do it with multiple crossings, overwhelming German defenses through simultaneous operations along the river's length. The Ghost Army would play a crucial role. Operation Viersen was conceived as perhaps the Ghost Army's most ambitious deception yet. As the Ninth Army prepared to cross the Rhine near the German town of Wesel, the Ghost Army would simulate a massive buildup near Viersen, about 15 miles south. The goal was to convince German forces that the main crossing would come at Viersen, causing them to position their defenses and reserves incorrectly. The scale of the operation was enormous. The Ghost Army would simulate 2 full divisions, the 35th Infantry and the 75th Infantry. They would create the appearance of major supply dumps, field hospitals, and all the infrastructure needed for a river crossing. The deception would need to be maintained for over a week, providing continuous evidence of American preparations. The men deployed to the Rhine in early March, before the actual crossing operations began. They worked with an urgency they had never experienced before. This deception could save hundreds, perhaps thousands of American lives if it worked. If it failed, the Rhine crossing could become a bloodbath. Inflatable tanks and trucks were positioned by the hundreds. The Ghost Army had accumulated massive amounts of equipment by this point in the war, and they deployed nearly all of it. Artists worked around the clock painting details on the decoys, adding realistic wear patterns and mud spatters. They studied photographs of real vehicle parks to ensure their layouts were convincing. The sonic deception was layered and complex. Recordings of bridging equipment being assembled, the sounds of engineering battalions at work, tank columns moving into staging positions, supply convoys arriving continuously. The audio program was carefully timed to suggest preparations building toward an assault. Radio traffic was intense and realistic. The signal company operators created the communication signature of major combat formations, supply operations, medical units, and command structures. They coordinated with real Allied units to ensure that administrative traffic, supply requests, and personnel matters all referenced the Phantom divisions. Even captured German intelligence documents from this period show that German commanders believed substantial American forces were massing near Viersen. But the Ghost Army added something new to Operation Viersen: visual special effects on a massive scale. They created dummy landing craft on the river, visible from the German-held East Bank. They built fake supply dumps using scrap materials, carefully arranged to look like ammunition, fuel, and food supplies from German aerial reconnaissance. They even created fake command posts in buildings near the river, complete with antenna arrays and communication cables running underground, cables that went nowhere but looked impressive. Some Ghost Army personnel actually entered partially destroyed buildings on the riverbank, buildings under direct German observation, and set up equipment there. It was extraordinarily dangerous work. German snipers watched the opposite shore constantly. Artillery could strike at any moment, but the men knew their presence would be reported, adding authenticity to the deception. The operation required coordination with Allied intelligence services. Ghost Army officers met with intelligence analysts to understand what German reconnaissance was likely to observe and what would convince them. They studied German doctrine for river crossing operations, learning what preparations the Germans would expect to see. Meanwhile, 15 miles north, the real preparations for the Wesel crossing proceeded. Combat engineers assembled actual bridging equipment. Artillery moved into position. Assault boats and amphibious vehicles were brought forward. Infantry battalions rehearsed their assault plans. All of this activity was carefully concealed and positioned to be invisible from German observation posts. On the night of March 23, 1945, the Rhine crossing began at Wesel. Allied artillery opened up with the largest bombardment since D-Day. Assault boats crossed the river under cover of smoke and darkness. Airborne forces dropped behind German lines, and the Germans, expecting the main crossing at Viersen based on the Ghost Army's deception, were caught out of position. The crossing was a success. Casualties were far lighter than expected. By dawn, Allied forces had established solid bridgeheads on the East Bank. The Rhine, impassable barrier for so many centuries, had been breached. Before the final push into Germany, the Ghost Army conducted numerous other operations that deserve recognition. Each mission refined their techniques and added to their impressive record of successful deceptions. Operation Bettemburg took place in Luxembourg in late September 1944, shortly after their success with Operation Wiltz. The objective was to simulate the 80th Infantry Division while that unit repositioned for offensive operations. The Ghost Army set up their equipment in the rolling countryside south of Luxembourg City, creating the appearance of a full division preparing for combat. What made Bettemburg particularly challenging was the terrain. The area was heavily forested, making it difficult to position equipment where it would be visible to German observation. The Ghost Army had to clear small areas within the forests, just enough to make their inflatable vehicles visible from key vantage points without making it obvious that clearings had been created specifically for this purpose. The sonic crews faced unique challenges as well. Sound propagates differently through dense forest than across open ground. The engineers had to adjust their speaker positions and volume levels to ensure their recordings would be audible to German positions without being so loud as to seem artificial. They conducted tests at different times of day, learning how temperature and humidity affected sound transmission through the trees. The operation lasted 6 days, during which the Ghost Army maintained the illusion of constant division-level activity. Radio operators simulated supply requests appropriate for a unit that had been in the line for weeks. Artists repainted the inflatable vehicles daily to show progressive weathering. Sonic trucks broadcast different programs of sound, maintenance activities during daylight hours, movement of patrol elements at night. German artillery responded to the Phantom Division, firing hundreds of shells at the Ghost Army positions. Several rubber tanks were destroyed, and 2 Ghost Army soldiers were wounded by shrapnel. But the deception held. The real 80th Division completed its redeployment undetected and subsequently launched a successful offensive that caught German forces by surprise. Operation Dallas came in October 1944 as Allied forces pushed toward the German border. The mission was to simulate the 5th Armored Division near Verdun, allowing the real division to move north for operations in the Ardennes region, the same area where the Battle of the Bulge would erupt 2 months later. The Ghost Army established their positions around Verdun, a city that held deep significance for both French and German forces. It had been the site of one of the longest and bloodiest battles of World War I, and the landscape still bore scars from that earlier conflict. The Ghost Army men found themselves setting up inflatable tanks within sight of World War I monuments and preserved trenches. The operation required careful coordination with French civilians who still lived in the area. The Ghost Army couldn't simply explain their true mission, but they needed local cooperation to maintain the deception. They portrayed themselves as advance elements of the 5th Armored Division, and local residents, grateful for liberation, readily accepted this explanation. Some Ghost Army personnel struck up friendships with Verdun residents. They were invited into homes for meals, rare moments of normalcy in the midst of war. One Ghost Army soldier, an artist named Harold Dahl, created sketches of local families as gifts. These drawings, made quickly in pencil or charcoal, captured moments of ordinary life in extraordinary times. Several of these sketches survive today in private collections. The sonic deception for Operation Dallas incorporated new techniques. The sound engineers had recorded genuine 5th Armored Division radio traffic and used these recordings to add authenticity to their broadcasts. They would play actual voice recordings of 5th Armored officers giving orders, mixing these with their standard sound effects. German intelligence listening posts would hear not just mechanical sounds, but actual human voices, adding layers of credibility to the deception. The operation was interrupted briefly when German forces launched a localized counterattack in the sector. Real American units bore the brunt of the fighting, but the Ghost Army found themselves close enough to the action that they could hear small arms fire and see the flashes of explosions. They maintained their positions and continued their deception, even as the battle raged nearby, understanding that pulling back would reveal their true nature. Operation Casanova unfolded in late October near Metz, one of the most heavily fortified cities in Western Europe. The Germans had held Metz since 1940 and had reinforced its already formidable defenses. Breaking through would require significant American strength, and the Ghost Army was tasked with making that strength appear even greater than it actually was. The deception involved simulating elements of multiple divisions converging on Metz from different directions. The Ghost Army split into smaller teams, each creating the appearance of battalion or regimental strength forces. This dispersed deployment was risky. If German forces attacked any one of the small Ghost Army teams, that team would be in serious danger. The men operated with heightened vigilance. They established defensive positions around their equipment, posted guards, and maintained constant radio communication between teams. At night, they could see the glow of artillery fire reflecting off clouds as real American units pounded German fortifications in Metz. One Ghost Army team, positioned in the village of Thionville, had a close call when a German patrol infiltrated American lines and approached their position. The Ghost Army soldiers, despite being primarily artists and technicians, responded like the soldiers they had become. They engaged the patrol in a brief firefight, killing 2 German soldiers and driving off the rest. The incident earned several Ghost Army men Bronze Stars for valor. The siege of Metz lasted weeks, and the Ghost Army maintained their deception throughout. German defenders had to allocate forces to multiple sectors, unable to concentrate their defense against the real American attacks because they believed they faced threats from several directions. When Metz finally fell in late November, Allied commanders credited the Ghost Army's work with dividing German defensive efforts. Operation Kodak was conducted in November near the Saar River, which formed part of the border between France and Germany. The objective was to simulate preparations for a river crossing, convincing Germans that the Americans would attempt to breach the Siegfried Line, Germany's western defensive fortifications, at that point. The Ghost Army deployed along the river, creating elaborate staging areas for an assault that would never come. They positioned inflatable bridging equipment, simulating engineer battalions preparing to span the river. They created fake supply dumps, stocked with rubber boats and bridging materials. They even went so far as to conduct reconnaissance patrols along the river bank, ensuring German observers would see American soldiers studying potential crossing points. The sonic deception was particularly elaborate. Sound trucks broadcast recordings of engineer units conducting training exercises, the sounds of boats being launched, bridging sections being assembled, even the splash of equipment being tested in water. These recordings were made specifically for this operation, with Ghost Army personnel recording actual bridging equipment exercises at rear area training facilities. Radio traffic simulated extensive planning for the river assault. Messages discussed water current measurements, riverbank soil composition, bridge construction timelines, and the coordination of artillery support for the crossing. All of this fictional planning sounded entirely authentic because Ghost Army officers had studied actual military engineering procedures and incorporated real technical details into their fake communications. German forces responded exactly as hoped. They reinforced the sector opposite the Ghost Army's positions, bringing in additional troops and artillery. They laid extensive minefields and constructed defensive positions covering the likely crossing points. Meanwhile, the real American assault on the Siegfried Line came dozens of miles away, where German defenses were thinner. After the Rhine crossing, the war entered its final phase. Allied armies poured into Germany, advancing against collapsing German resistance. The Ghost Army found themselves operating in enemy territory, a strange and often surreal experience for men who had spent the last year liberating occupied countries. Germany, in April 1945, was a landscape of devastation. Cities lay in ruins from years of Allied bombing. Refugees clogged the roads, fleeing the advancing Soviet armies from the east. German soldiers surrendered by the thousands, exhausted and defeated. Nazi propaganda still blared from loudspeakers in some areas, promising miracle weapons and final victory even as the Third Reich crumbled. The Ghost Army's operations took on a different character in these final weeks. With German forces in disarray and retreat, elaborate long-term deceptions were less necessary. Instead, the unit focused on quick tactical operations, simulating American strength in one sector to cover movements in another, creating phantom forces that would cause German units to withdraw rather than fight. Operation Lochmühle was one of the first operations conducted on German soil, taking place near the town of Briey in early March 1945. The mission was to simulate the 90th Infantry Division, allowing that division to redeploy for the Rhine crossing operations. The Ghost Army found themselves operating in an area that had changed hands multiple times during the war, where the local population was uncertain whether to view the Americans as liberators or conquerors. The deception required sensitivity to civilian concerns. German propaganda had told civilians that American forces would commit atrocities, and many German civilians were terrified. Ghost Army soldiers, many of whom spoke German and had family connections to Germany, found themselves in the unusual position of trying to calm civilian fears while simultaneously maintaining their military deception. One Ghost Army soldier, a young man named Frederick Fox, whose family had emigrated from Germany 2 generations earlier, served as an unofficial liaison with local civilians. He assured them that American forces would not harm them if they cooperated. He arranged for medical care for sick children and elderly residents. He helped reunite families that had been separated by the fighting. all while maintaining the fiction that he was part of the 90th Infantry Division. The operation succeeded both militarily and humanely. German forces in the sector remained fixed in place, watching the Phantom 90th Division, while the real division moved into position for the Rhine crossing. And the civilians in the area were treated with respect and compassion, contradicting the Nazi propaganda they had been fed. Operation Viersen II was conducted in early April along the Weser River. As Allied forces prepared to cross, the Ghost Army created diversionary deployments that drew German attention away from the actual crossing points. The operation was smaller in scale than the Rhine deception, but demonstrated the Ghost Army's adaptability to changing circumstances. By this point in the war, German intelligence capabilities had deteriorated significantly. Many of their best intelligence officers had been killed or captured. Their aerial reconnaissance was limited by fuel shortages and Allied air superiority. Their radio intercept capabilities were compromised by constant Allied jamming. The Ghost Army adapted their techniques accordingly, sometimes using simpler deceptions, because the Germans were no longer capable of the sophisticated analysis that would have detected them. For Viersen II, the Ghost Army created a relatively straightforward illusion, a single infantry division preparing to cross the river at a specific point. They used fewer inflatable vehicles than in earlier operations, but positioned them more visibly. They broadcast sonic deceptions at higher volumes, knowing that German sound-ranging capabilities were reduced. They used less sophisticated radio traffic, understanding that German intercept stations were overwhelmed and undermanned. The operation worked perfectly. German defenders positioned their limited forces to oppose the Phantom crossing, and the real Allied assault came at a weakly defended point miles away. The Weser was crossed with minimal casualties, and Allied forces poured into central Germany. Operation Troutman. In mid-April represented one of the Ghost Army's final operations. As Allied forces advanced deeper into Germany, they encountered pockets of fanatical resistance in some areas, while other German units surrendered immediately. The Ghost Army was tasked with supporting the 16th Armored Division as it pushed toward the Danube River. The mission was unusual in that it wasn't a pure deception. Instead, the Ghost Army served as force multiplier, making the actual 16th Armored Division appear larger than it was. They positioned their inflatable tanks alongside real tanks, creating the visual impression of a massive armored force. They broadcast sonic deceptions that exaggerated the sounds of the real division's movements. They augmented the division's actual radio traffic with additional phantom messages. The effect was powerful. German defenders, already demoralized and exhausted, believed they faced overwhelming American strength. Several German units surrendered without fighting rather than face what they thought was a massive armored assault. Other German forces withdrew from defensive positions, allowing the real 16th Armored Division to advance rapidly with minimal resistance. Operation Troutman demonstrated the Ghost Army's evolution. They had started the war creating complete phantom units from nothing. By the war's end, they had learned to amplify real forces, multiplying American combat power through perception management. They had become masters of psychological warfare, understanding how to break enemy will without firing shots. The men saw things in Germany that they would never forget. They passed through concentration camps that had been liberated by other Allied units. They saw the full horror of Nazi atrocities, the gas chambers, the mass graves, the surviving prisoners who were little more than walking skeletons. The artists who had joined the military to use their creative skills for deception now used those same skills to document war crimes. Several Ghost Army soldiers made sketches and paintings of what they witnessed, creating a visual record of the Holocaust's final chapter. They also saw the human cost of total war. German civilians huddled in the ruins of their cities, hungry and homeless, children who had known nothing but war their entire lives, elderly people whose families had been scattered or killed. The Ghost Army soldiers, many of whom spoke some German, found themselves interacting with enemy civilians who were often pathetically grateful for American rations and medical care. Operation Boulet took place in mid-April as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany. The Ghost Army simulated the 63rd Infantry Division, allowing the real division to redeploy for offensive operations. But with German collapse accelerating, the operation was cut short. German forces in the sector simply abandoned their positions rather than face what they thought was a full division. The pace of events accelerated dramatically. Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. German forces in Italy surrendered on May 2nd. By May 7th, Germany had signed an unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The Ghost Army's final operation, Operation Viersen 4, never actually took place. The unit had been preparing for another Rhine area deception when the surrender came. The inflatable tanks remained deflated. The sound trucks remained silent. The radio operators stood down from their phantom networks. For the men of the Ghost Army, the end of the war brought a strange mix of emotions: relief that the fighting was over, exhaustion from months of constant operations, pride in what they had accomplished, but also a kind of anticlimax. They had spent a year creating elaborate illusions for an enemy that no longer existed. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, the Ghost Army found themselves with an unexpected mission, actually being peacekeeping troops in occupied Germany. The artists and engineers who had spent the war creating fake military units now had to perform the duties of real military police and occupation forces. They were stationed in various locations across the American occupation zone. Some were assigned to guard duty at displaced persons camps, helping to process the millions of refugees and former prisoners trying to find their way home or to new lives. Others helped with the vast administrative task of processing surrendered German soldiers, collecting weapons, and maintaining order in areas where the normal structures of government and law enforcement had collapsed. It was during this period that many Ghost Army soldiers learned the full extent of their impact. They encountered German officers who mentioned the strong American forces they had believed were in certain locations, forces that had been nothing but the Ghost Army's illusions. They read captured German intelligence reports that showed how completely the deceptions had worked. They met other American soldiers who told them about successful operations that had depended on German forces being positioned incorrectly thanks to the Ghost Army's work. Official estimates would later suggest that the Ghost Army's operations had saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives. Their deceptions had tied down German divisions, caused enemy forces to waste ammunition on fake targets, and enabled Allied operations to achieve surprise repeatedly. For a unit of only about 1,100 men that never fired a shot in combat, the impact was extraordinary. But the Ghost Army's story wasn't destined to be told immediately. As the war ended, the unit's operations were classified. The techniques they had developed, the equipment they had used, the very fact that such a unit existed, all of this was deemed military secret. The men of the Ghost Army were sworn to secrecy. They were forbidden from discussing their wartime service in detail. Even their families were told only that they had served in a special engineering unit in Europe. This secrecy would last for decades. While veterans of famous infantry divisions and armored units could share their stories freely, the men of the Ghost Army had to remain silent. They couldn't explain to their children why they had paintings and sketches from the war, but no combat medals. They couldn't tell their grandchildren about the time they fooled an entire German army group with rubber tanks and sound effects. The men went their separate ways after demobilization. They returned to civilian life, many resuming the artistic careers that had been interrupted by the war. Bill Blass returned to fashion design, eventually becoming one of the most successful designers in American history. His Ghost Army experience would influence his work. He once said that learning to create convincing illusions with limited resources taught him valuable lessons about design and presentation. Ellsworth Kelly went back to painting, developing an abstract style that would make him one of the most important American artists of the 20th century. His wartime experience, seeing the French countryside and the devastation of war, influenced his minimalist aesthetic and his use of bold, flat colors. Art Kane became a fashion photographer. creating some of the most iconic images of the 1960s and 70s. His understanding of how to construct convincing scenes and manipulate perception, learned in the Ghost Army, served him well behind the camera. Many others pursued successful careers in art, design, advertising, and entertainment. The Ghost Army veterans formed an informal network, staying in touch over the years. They would occasionally gather for reunions where they could finally talk freely among themselves about their wartime experiences. These gatherings became increasingly important as the years passed, a chance for aging veterans to share memories that they still couldn't share with anyone else. The secrecy began to lift gradually. In the 1980s and 90s, some information about the Ghost Army was declassified. Veterans could finally start telling their stories. A few journalists and historians began researching the unit, piecing together its history from documents and interviews. But it wasn't until the 2000s that the Ghost Army story truly became public. A series of books, documentaries, and exhibitions brought their remarkable tale to light. Americans learned about the artists who had fought World War II with creativity instead of weapons. The story captured imaginations. It was so unusual, so clever, so very American in its irreverent approach to warfare. In 2022, the Ghost Army veterans received formal recognition when Congress awarded the unit the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. By that time, very few Ghost Army veterans remained alive. Those who did attend the ceremony were in their late 90s or older, but they had finally received acknowledgement for their service, and their story was now part of the official historical record. The Ghost Army's success was built on continuous technical innovation. From their first operations in Normandy to their final preparations at the war's end, they constantly refined and improved their methods. The inflatable equipment evolved significantly. Early models were fragile and difficult to maintain. The rubber was too thin and tore easily. The inflation systems were unreliable. But engineers worked constantly to improve the designs. By the war's end, the inflatables were much more durable. New materials made them more resistant to damage. Improved inflation valves made deployment faster and more reliable. The artists developed increasingly sophisticated painting techniques. They learned to create realistic weathering effects, making brand new rubber tanks look like they had seen weeks of combat. They understood how light and shadow would fall at different times of day and from different viewing angles. They knew which details would be visible from German observation posts and which could be omitted to save time. The most sophisticated evolution came in the radio deception techniques. Early operations used relatively simple patterns of radio traffic. But as the war progressed, the signal company developed elaborate systems that mimicked real military communications with extraordinary fidelity. They created procedures for generating the dozens or hundreds of messages that a real division would transmit each day. They developed coded messages that would sound authentic to German radio intelligence without actually revealing operational information. Messages that looked like real military communications but were actually carefully crafted fiction. They learned to mimic the individual styles of different radio operators. Just as everyone has a distinctive handwriting, each radio operator has a distinctive fist, the pattern and rhythm with which they send Morse code. German radio intelligence could identify individual operators and track their movements. The Ghost Army's operators learned to imitate the fists of real operators from the units they were simulating, adding another layer of authenticity to their deceptions. The sonic deception equipment also evolved. Early sound trucks were simply vehicles with speakers. Later versions had sophisticated mixing equipment that could layer different recordings, adjust volumes dynamically, and create more realistic soundscapes. Operators learned to position multiple sound trucks to create directional effects, making it seem like sounds were coming from specific locations. They developed new recording techniques, capturing more authentic sounds and learning how to edit and mix them effectively. They created libraries of sounds that could be combined in different ways for different situations. They even made recordings in different weather conditions, understanding that sound propagates differently in rain, snow, or fog. The Ghost Army also pioneered integration between different types of deception. They learned to coordinate visual, sonic, and radio deception to create comprehensive illusions.
A Phantom Armored Division would have inflatable tanks visible in certain locations, sound trucks broadcasting appropriate noises, and radio traffic indicating command posts and supply operations, all coordinated to tell a consistent story to German intelligence.
The Ghost Army's story offers profound lessons about the nature of warfare, creativity, and human ingenuity. Their success demonstrated that in modern conflict, perception can be as important as firepower. An enemy who makes decisions based on false information is already defeated, regardless of how many tanks or soldiers they command. The military implications were recognized even during the war. Allied commanders came to value deception operations highly, understanding that they were force multipliers. A small unit like the Ghost Army could have effects far beyond its actual size. The principles developed by the Ghost Army influenced military doctrine for decades after the war. Modern armies continue to employ deception techniques, though the specific methods have evolved with technology. The Ghost Army proved that warfare wasn't just the province of professional soldiers. Artists, designers, sound engineers, creative people who thought differently from traditional military minds could make crucial contributions. The unit was proof that diverse perspectives and unconventional thinking could solve problems that conventional approaches couldn't address. Their story also highlights the importance of detailed, meticulous work in intelligence operations. The Ghost Army succeeded because they paid attention to the smallest details. A shadow painted at the wrong angle, a sound recording with poor timing, a radio message that didn't fit standard protocols. Any of these could have revealed the deception. Success required not just creativity, but also technical precision and deep understanding of how enemy intelligence worked. The human dimension of the Ghost Army's story is equally important. These were men who were artists and creative professionals in civilian life, suddenly thrust into war. They had to learn not just military skills, but how to function under extreme stress, how to work as part of a team with lives depending on their performance, how to maintain their humanity in the midst of industrial-scale violence. Many Ghost Army veterans spoke afterward about how their wartime experience changed them. They had seen the worst that humans could do to each other, the concentration camps, the destroyed cities, the countless dead. But they had also been part of something that saved lives rather than took them. They had used creativity and intelligence to make a difference in the world's darkest hour. The Ghost Army's artists continued making art throughout the war, even in the most difficult circumstances. They sketched in foxholes, painted in bombed-out buildings, created beauty amid devastation. This impulse to create, to make something meaningful, even in the midst of destruction, sustained them through the hardest times. It was a form of resistance against the dehumanization of war. Some of the art they created during the war survives today. Sketches of French villages and German ruins, portraits of fellow soldiers, satirical cartoons of military life, landscapes of the European countryside. This body of work provides a unique perspective on World War II, the view of artists who were both participants in and observers of the conflict. When historians finally had access to Ghost Army records and could compare them with German intelligence documents and operational reports, the full scope of their achievement became clear. The numbers are impressive, but also incomplete. It's impossible to quantify exactly how many lives were saved or how many German mistakes were caused by the Ghost Army's work. The unit conducted over 20 major operations and numerous smaller missions. They impersonated 2 complete corps, the 9th and the 14th, and many individual divisions. They created the illusion of approximately 11 divisions over the course of the war, with some divisions being impersonated multiple times in different locations. German intelligence reports from throughout this period show that Wehrmacht commanders consistently believed they faced larger American forces than actually existed in many sectors. This misperception influenced German operational planning and resource allocation. Divisions were held in defensive positions to counter threats that didn't exist. Reserves were positioned to respond to phantom American units. Artillery was fired at rubber decoys instead of real targets. The tactical advantages the Ghost Army created were considerable. Allied units achieved surprise in numerous operations because German forces were looking in the wrong direction. Offensive operations succeeded with fewer casualties because German defenses were positioned incorrectly. Strategic movements of Allied forces went undetected because German intelligence was focused on the Ghost Army's phantoms. But beyond the military metrics, the Ghost Army demonstrated something important about human creativity and adaptability. A group of artists and engineers, given a seemingly impossible mission, developed techniques and methods that worked. They learned on the job, adapted to changing circumstances, and ultimately became masters of their unusual craft. The financial cost of the Ghost Army was minimal compared to its impact. The entire unit's budget for equipment and operations was less than the cost of a few bombers. The inflatable tanks, despite being custom-made props, were far cheaper than real tanks. The radio and sonic equipment, while sophisticated, was a bargain compared to artillery or armor. In cost-benefit terms, the Ghost Army may have been the best investment the U.S. military made during World War II. The influence on post-war military thinking was substantial. The Ghost Army's success helped establish deception operations as a permanent part of military doctrine. Modern armies have dedicated units for electronic warfare, psychological operations, and deception. While the specific techniques have changed, satellites make inflatable tanks less useful, while cyber operations and electronic jamming have become new forms of deception. The underlying principles remain those proven by the Ghost Army. Intelligence services also learned from the Ghost Army. The CIA and other agencies studied their techniques for creating convincing false realities. The methods for coordinating visual, audio, and communications deception became standard procedures for intelligence operations. The Ghost Army had proven that with sufficient attention to detail and understanding of how the enemy thinks, even elaborate deceptions could be sustained successfully. As the decades passed and Ghost Army veterans aged, their story took on new significance. In a world increasingly concerned with fake news and manipulated information, the Ghost Army represented something different. Deception used for unquestionably moral purposes, to save lives and defeat genuine evil. The surviving veterans became sought-after speakers and interview subjects. They appeared in documentaries, gave presentations at schools and museums, and shared their stories with historians. There was something poignant about these elderly men, many in their 90s, describing with youthful enthusiasm how they had once fooled the German military with rubber tanks and sound effects. Their art from the war period gained new appreciation. Museums mounted exhibitions of Ghost Army sketches and paintings. The work was valued not just for its artistic merit, but for its historical significance. These were images created by participants in crucial historical events, offering unique perspectives on the war. Several Ghost Army veterans wrote memoirs or participated in oral history projects. Their accounts provide invaluable insights into the experience of serving in such an unusual unit. They wrote about the fear and exhaustion, but also the camaraderie and the satisfaction of using their creative skills for important purposes. They described the surreal experience of being artists in a war zone, of creating illusions while surrounded by deadly reality. The younger generation discovered the Ghost Army story through various media. Rick Byers' documentary, The Ghost Army, brought their tale to PBS viewers. Books by Jack Neese and others provided detailed histories. Podcasts and YouTube videos introduced their story to new audiences. The Ghost Army became a source of fascination for people interested in World War II, military history, art, and creative problem-solving. Educational institutions developed curricula around the Ghost Army story. It provided a perfect case study for discussions about creativity, innovation, problem-solving, and the ethical use of deception. Students could explore questions about the morality of manipulation, even for good purposes. They could examine how diverse perspectives and unconventional thinking can solve problems that conventional approaches cannot address. The Ghost Army's legacy extends beyond their specific wartime accomplishments. They represent the principle that creativity and intelligence can be as powerful as weapons. They prove that art and design are not frivolous pursuits, but practical skills with real-world applications. They demonstrate that thinking differently, approaching problems from unusual angles, can produce remarkable results. Their story is also a reminder that war is not just about bravery and sacrifice, though it is certainly about those things, but also about ingenuity and innovation. The Ghost Army won victories without firing shots, saved lives without violence, and defeated enemies through cleverness rather than force. In the midst of history's most destructive war, they represented a different kind of power. As the last Ghost Army veterans pass away, the youngest are now in their late 90s or beyond, their story transitions from living memory to history, but it's a story that continues to resonate. The Ghost Army represents something fundamentally hopeful. The idea that creativity, intelligence, and imagination can make a difference in the world, even in the darkest times. The inflatable tanks have long since been deflated and discarded. The sound recordings are preserved in archives but rarely played. The radio procedures are obsolete in an age of satellite communications. But the spirit of the Ghost Army lives on, in the veterans who served, in the families who preserve their memories, in the historians who study their operations, and in everyone who finds inspiration in their remarkable story. They were artists who went to war. They were ordinary men who accomplished extraordinary things. They were the Ghost Army, and though their phantoms have faded into history, their legacy endures. In the end, perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Ghost Army is that their story was true. It sounds like fiction, a unit of artists creating fake armies with rubber props and sound effects, fooling elite German intelligence officers repeatedly across Western Europe. But it happened. The impossible mission succeeded. The ghosts were real, even though everything they represented was illusion. And somewhere in that paradox, the real ghosts, the true illusions, lies the essential magic of what they accomplished. They proved that perception shapes reality, that creativity can change outcomes, and that imagination, properly applied, can be as powerful as any weapon ever forged. The Ghost Army served with honor, distinction, and remarkable success in World War II. Their story deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and studied. They were heroes of an unconventional kind, and their war was fought with tools no army had used before or has used quite the same way since. This is their story, as complete as we can tell it now, decades after the guns fell silent and the last inflatable tank was packed away. It's a story about war and art, about creativity and courage, about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when history demanded it of them. And it's a story that reminds us that even in the darkest times, human ingenuity and imagination can find ways to make a difference. The Ghost Army proved it, one illusion at a time.